The Mason family's camping trip turned to panic when their terrier Luna chased a deer into the notorious Blackwater Swamp. As night fell, Luna's desperate howls grew weaker, with rangers refusing to attempt a rescue until morning. The family listened helplessly as their beloved pet's cries faded into silence. By dawn, the swamp had fallen completely silent, and what happened next left the entire search party frozen in disbelief. When the Mason family first moved to Pineville, they were seeking the quiet peace of small-town life. The modest community nestled between rolling hills and dense woodland seemed perfect for raising their children and giving their energetic white terrier, Luna, the space she needed to run and play. What they hadn't counted on were the warnings that came almost immediately from their new neighbors. Every small town has its legends and rumors, but in Pineville, the whispers all centered around one particular figure, a ragged man who lived somewhere in the woods on the outskirts of town. No one knew his real name. No one knew his story. What they did know, or at least believed, was that he was dangerous. This mysterious figure was occasionally spotted at the general store buying minimal supplies, his appearance always causing discomfort among the other patrons. With his long, matted beard, layers of worn clothing regardless of the season, and the way he muttered to himself as he shuffled through the aisles, he had become something of a local bogeyman. Parents routinely warned their children to come straight home if they ever spotted him, and more than one concerned citizen had called the sheriff to report suspicious behavior when the man was sighted. The Masons listened politely to these warnings, but had never encountered the man themselves during their first 3 months in town. They were too busy settling into their new home and exploring the natural beauty that surrounded Pineville. For Luna especially, their move from a cramped city apartment to the wide-open countryside was nothing short of paradise. With summer in full swing, the Masons decided it was the perfect time for their first camping trip to the famous Willow Lake just outside town. They packed their tent, fishing gear, and enough food for a weekend adventure. The weather forecast promised clear skies and warm temperatures, perfect camping conditions. The first day exceeded their expectations. The lake sparkled in the sunlight as they hiked along its shores, pointing out colorful birds and unique plants to the children. Luna bounded ahead on her leash, nose working overtime to catalog all the new scents. That evening, as the family gathered around their campfire to roast marshmallows, there was a sense of perfect contentment. As Mr. Mason fired up the portable grill to prepare dinner, a young deer suddenly burst from the underbrush, darting directly through their campsite. In the split second of chaos that followed, Luna yanked her leash out of 10-year-old Amy Mason's hand and took off after the deer, disappearing into the thick forest surrounding the lake. At first, the family wasn't overly concerned. Luna had chased squirrels and rabbits before, but always returned within minutes, tongue lolling and tail wagging. But as 30 minutes stretched into an hour with no sign of their pet, worry began to set in. The Masons spread out around their campsite, calling Luna's name and listening intently for the jingling of her collar tags. As twilight deepened into dusk, Mr. Mason pulled out his phone and called the park ranger station. 2 rangers arrived at their campsite just as night was fully settling in, armed with powerful flashlights and a detailed map of the area. They organized a search pattern, focusing first on the direction where Luna had last been seen. Another hour passed with no success. The children were fighting back tears now, and Mrs. Mason was trying to remain optimistic while fear gnawed at her stomach. That's when they heard it, a distant, plaintive howl cutting through the night air. Everyone froze, straining to hear. The sound came again, unmistakably the cry of a dog in distress. One of the rangers, a weathered man named Peterson, checked his map with a grim expression. He shone his flashlight in the direction of the howls and spoke in a low voice. The cries were coming from Blackwater Swamp, one of the most dangerous areas in the entire park. Blackwater wasn't just any swamp. It was a treacherous maze of deep mud pits and quicksand with deceptively solid-looking ground that could swallow a grown man in minutes. Even experienced rangers avoided entering it without proper equipment and daylight on their side. Ranger Peterson delivered the devastating news that no search could be conducted until morning. It was simply too dangerous to attempt navigating the swamp in darkness. The risk of losing human lives was too great. But as they stood there listening to Luna's increasingly desperate howls, The Mason family found this impossible to accept. Mr. Mason grabbed his flashlight and started toward the swamp edge, determined to at least try to reach their beloved pet. He managed to wade several yards into the muck before Ranger Peterson and his colleague physically restrained him, explaining in stark terms how easily he could become trapped himself. The family returned to their campsite under the ranger's insistence, but sleep was impossible. Throughout that long, terrible night, Luna's howls continued, becoming weaker and more sporadic as the hours passed. Each cry tore at the Masons' hearts, knowing their pet was suffering and they were helpless to reach her. By dawn, the howls had become so faint they were barely audible. When the first gray light filtered through the trees, a proper search and rescue team had assembled, including rangers with specialized equipment for traversing the swamp. But their faces betrayed little optimism. Animals trapped in Blackwater rarely survived the night. As the morning fog began to lift, the search party stood at the edge of the swamp, planning their approach. The silence was now complete. Luna's cries had stopped entirely, which everyone knew was a bad sign. Mrs. Mason held her children close, preparing them for the worst. Suddenly, one of the rangers pointed toward a distant shape emerging from the mist. At first, it appeared to be nothing more than another dark tree stump in the swamp. But then it moved, slowly trudging toward them through the shallow water at the swamp's edge. The search party tensed, unsure what they were seeing. As the figure drew closer, they could make out a human form, completely covered in dark mud from head to toe. In his arms, he carried something small and equally mud-coated. The children were the first to realize. Amy gasped and broke away from her mother, running toward the approaching figure despite the ranger's warnings to stay back. Because in the arms of this mud-covered stranger was a small, dirty, but very much alive Luna. The figure finally stepped onto solid ground, gently setting the exhausted dog down. Luna immediately wobbled toward the Mason family, her tail making weak attempts to wag. As the family embraced their pet with tears of joy, everyone's attention turned to the mysterious rescuer. As he wiped mud from his face, the search party realized with shock that this was the infamous wild man of Pineville. The hermit everyone feared and avoided had just emerged from the deadly swamp, carrying the dog no one else could reach. The man stood quietly, somewhat uncomfortable with all the attention. When Ranger Peterson asked how he had managed to find and rescue Luna in such dangerous conditions, the hermit spoke in a surprisingly articulate, educated voice that contradicted his appearance. He introduced himself as Michael and explained that he knew the swamp better than anyone. He had been living in these woods for 7 years, mapping every inch of the terrain. When he heard the commotion and the dog's distress through the night, he knew exactly which section of the swamp had trapped her and the safe pathways to reach that spot. The Masons were stunned to learn that the wild man they had been warned about was once Dr. Michael Harrington, a respected wildlife biologist who had worked at universities and national parks before personal tragedy and subsequent depression had led him to seek solitude in the wilderness. His intimate knowledge of local ecosystems and animal behavior had allowed him to survive alone, and ultimately, to save Luna when no one else could. In the days that followed, the story of Luna's miraculous rescue spread throughout Pineville, forcing many residents to reconsider their assumptions about the man they had feared for so long. The Masons invited Michael to dinner at their home the following week. When he arrived, clean-shaven and in borrowed clothes, many wouldn't have recognized him as the same person. Luna certainly remembered him, though. Far from the terrified howls in the swamp, she greeted Michael with enthusiastic jumps and licks, recognizing her savior even without the mud. Through this unexpected connection, Michael slowly began reintegrating into society. The Masons helped him find part-time work using his extensive knowledge of local wildlife, and the community that had once shunned him now sought out his expertise. Sometimes it takes a crisis to see the humanity in those we've chosen to fear or ignore. And sometimes the most unlikely heroes emerge when we least expect them, but need them most. What assumptions might you be making about someone in your community based on appearances alone?